The final film is not just a presentation of the information, it's also in some ways a character study.
I think it's always interesting, especially with documentaries, how did this kind of topic come to you? How did you kind of get involved in the intactivist issue?
So it's a little easier to explain now that you've seen it, because I've had a lot of people ask, why would you make a documentary about circumcision? And then you see it and you're like, oh, I did not realize all of that. So I had the obsessive epiphany that John Geishker talks about here. And actually, he's here in the audience. Yeah, so thank you to John. We were going to bring him up for the Q&A, so if you guys have a question directed at him, let us know. But I had that obsessive epiphany, and initially when I went through a period in my life where I was in general letting go of old patterns that didn't serve me and things that I'd picked up in childhood that I was letting go of. And I ran across this issue, and every time I ran across it, I thought, well, there's nothing I can do about that now. And it's kind of uncomfortable, so why think about it, out of sight, out of mind. And it wasn't until later when I have a meditation practice and I was doing that, and in meditation you just be present with whatever comes up without without judging it, without adding to it or anything like that. And so I had this topic come into my mind during meditation, and there was like this really cold feeling in the body around it, and I just sort of thought, that was strange, like what was that? And I pay attention to what comes up in that space, and so I started researching, and one of the first things I found was foreskin restoration, which we talk about in the film. And I thought, oh, there is something you can do about it, and I've never been told that before. Like the cultural meme around this is that it's a decision you make once and then you never think about it again. But there was this whole other thing I didn't know about, so I started researching everything I could. And I have a background as a filmmaker. I work as a freelance editor. That's what I went to film school for. And so I was feeling very depressed for like a month after learning all of this. And I needed a way to move that energy in some way. I was talking to a friend who does documentary filmmaking and cinematography, and I was sharing with her some of the things that I'd learned. And she said, Brendan, I'm working on 3 documentaries right now. What you're telling me is more interesting than all of them. Why are you not making a film about this? And I was like, that's an interesting idea. So within 2 weeks, I'd called up every person whose book I'd read, every person whose website I'd saw, and said, I'm going to be in your town during these dates. We're doing a documentary. Can I interview you? And inevitably, they would say, oh, of course. And while you're here, you know who else you should talk to? And so I started finding the interview subjects that maybe didn't have a website or weren't that publicly known, and that was it. It was just down the wormhole for 6 years making that. So yeah, so that was the process.
And so this is the first film that you made?
This is the first feature as director.
Wow.
Yes.
Very, very impressive. Yes, Andy.
Yeah, so you had great access to some of the apparently most important figures in this. How difficult, how did you sell it to people on the different sides, and how difficult was it to get those people to speak on camera?
Easy, actually, and with some. It sort of depended. The ones that we got, first of all, I was working on this a long time, so I had time to sort of track each of them down. And with a lot of them, they wanted to talk on this topic. Like on both sides, they wanted to make their perspective heard. And even, like one of the major pro-circumcision voices, Brian Morris, like when I interviewed him, he wanted to sort of verbally debate the intactivists, essentially. And I also, I deliberately didn't put a lot online early on in the process because I didn't want someone to see an early version of the film and then judge it by that. So, early on in the process, I had, there was a urologist and Moyle, a Jewish ritual circumciser who I called, and I said, I'm doing a documentary, can I interview you? And he said, well, you're not going to interview this intactivists, are you? Because if you're interviewing them, I don't want to be in it, and I want final edit over everything I'm in. And I was like, I'm not going to give you executive producer privileges just to appear in the movie. But that made me a little worried initially. This was like very early in the process. And so I thought, well, I want to be honest with people. I want to tell them that I'm interviewing both sides and doing this thing. But I also want people to appear in the movie. So I was worried that would be like a common thing. And so I got a book on documentary filmmaking, and it had an ethics section in it. And I thought, I'm going to read what that says and just follow that. And so I opened it up, and it says, you should give your interview subjects informed consent, and then it gave the medical definition of informed consent, which, for those of you who are familiar with this issue, that's completely useless, because the informed consent for circumcision is, would you like your child circumcised? And they don't give any of this information at all. So I was like, okay. And I just basically, I would go to people, and I would use that. I said, I'm doing a documentary, would you like to be in it? And if they asked any questions, I'm completely upfront. There's one of the major pro-circumcision people we interviewed who I gave him my full personal story, and he knew, he was upfront with that. But most of them, they either knew how controversial it was and they wanted to put themselves out there on that, or they didn't. I mean, there was one Moyle I called many different Jewish ritual circumcisers, and none of them would appear on the film. And one of them I called, and I started, I'm doing a documentary, and before I could even finish, he said, no, absolutely not. I was like, okay, do you mind me asking why? And he said, because circumcision is going to be the abortion debate of the 21st century. And then he hung up on me. And I was like, man, I really wish you'd said that on camera. That would have been great. But yeah, the ones who appeared, they were willing to debate. That's what they wanted to put their voice out there on. And so the ones that were in here were fairly easy to get. And there were a few like that who said no. But I think it's also that when I started, there wasn't the distribution, like literally the way that we're distributing now, those distribution methods didn't exist when I started making the film. So it's changed a lot over the time. Yeah.
Was there anything you wanted to include or any questions you wanted to ask that isn't included in the video?
Well, the first edit was like 5 hours. And that was like the assembly edit, the one that I knew no one would ever see, because it was just everything I'd ever want to say on this topic. And I'd say the one scene that I thought, ooh, that was really interesting that I wasn't able to include was Fuambai, the sort of pro-circumcision woman who appears in the film. She's also a brilliant cultural anthropologist and has done a lot of work around the symbolism of this. And she had something where she broke down in traditional African society what the symbolism of circumcision is. So in traditional African societies, it is thought that the foreskin is the feminine element in men, and the clitoris is the male element in women. And that you basically had to create gender by removing that element from one gender. And that part of the reason she thought that the United States and Western countries were so against female circumcision was because women in those cultures had fought extremely hard for the right to play the male role. And the idea of taking that away from women was like the most offensive thing you could do. And I took from that that our culture also doesn't really value the feminine in men. Like, we sort of begrudgingly accept, like, yeah, maybe men can do that too, maybe now, but we don't really value it. And so the idea of taking away the feminine element and that sort of symbolic thing from men is considered totally okay in our culture because we don't really value it. But women playing both male and female role, I mean, that's a human right. But men, well, we haven't really gone through that movement yet. So that was something that was really interesting to me, but it was a tangent on African tribal anthropological symbolism that just didn't really fit in any place in the film.
I think it's very interesting, especially hearing about how you kind of came about the film with some kind of, I don't want to say bias because that sounds too strong, but that there is such a kind of a representation from that woman, from the pro-circumcision people. How important was that for you to show the other side of the argument as well?
Well, I mean, if you read Michael Moore's stuff on documentary filmmaking, you should basically only interview people who disagree with you, right? And I felt like it was really important because, like, they've done studies on, well, I mean, for one, I was just curious what they had to say. And I felt like if I'm going to do a documentary, I have to show both sides, just from an ethical perspective. But I also, you know, when you start studying how people learn, they've done studies where they present someone with information and then they give them a test, and they've found that often when you do that, people actually score worse than they did before. But if you show them a dialogue between people that addresses the misconceptions they might have, where you have one person argue the misconception and another argues the facts, then that's how people actually learn. And if you think about how humans have evolved to learn, we learn through social dialogue. So if you were to just show one side, if you were to show, this is what I believe, and not actually address the misconceptions, you'd actually leave people worse off than they were before. And the tricky thing with this issue isn't that no one knows anything about it, it's that people think they know a lot about it that is often untrue. I mean, in Soraya Miri, who's the woman who helped get the 1996 female genital cutting law passed, her memoir is called The Girl with Three Legs, and in her culture it's thought, she's Somalian, that if a man's penis touches a woman's clitoris, it'll fall off. And they literally refer to women who are intact as the girl with three legs, hence the name of her memoir. And we look at that and like, that's crazy. But in American culture, we have this idea that the foreskin, the way that men are naturally born, is diseased and awful, and your penis is basically trying to kill you, and you have to cut part of it off first, or else it's going to get you. And like, the kind of, we're a very highly evolved society. We're so modern, and those people over there, they're bad. They're pretty similar on some things.
Yes.
More of a statement, but I would love to see a poll on how many people that watch this movie, believe the movie, still pro-circumcision.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the evidence is fairly kind of compelling. It's a kind of absolutely having that kind of data would be eye-opening. Yes.
Yeah, what year was the San Francisco initiative, and have there been any legislative successes anywhere in America?
So that was in 2012, and the short answer is no. In fact, after that ballot initiative, there was a court case to remove it. I mean, first of all, you've got like 30 activists and their ragtag efforts versus the Anti-Defamation League with their $70 million, and the ACLU actually backed them of Southern California, and all of the entire medical industry. So they actually got a law passed in California. I think it's like AB 7. There's a couple numbers after that. I don't remember it off the top of my head. But basically, enshrined in California law is that no place in California can ever pass a law against circumcision. It is now legally protected in California. And legal experts have looked at it and been like, based on this law, you could forcibly circumcise your 17-year-old yourself as a punishment for something. Like, it is that protected in California law. And they were ready too. They had a congressman who was ready to introduce a national bill saying the same thing in the event that that didn't go through. So the legal efforts there, people have sort of backed away from because basically the culture isn't ready yet. And they don't have the resources and the legal firepower and the money to do that. And in fact, the legislation that was used to throw out the court initiative, we didn't have time to get into it because it's like a legal technicality, but it was basically that cities and counties in California can't regulate medical practice, and it was a law that was originally created to stop local counties from passing laws against docking animals' tails. And so, like, literally, men's rights are sort of slightly below animals on the legal scale, so to speak. However, shortly after that, there was a court case in Germany where there was a botched circumcision of a Muslim child, and they ruled that that was not ethical and that was not legal. And again, there was like this huge push against that because people didn't like that. And now, I think European countries might pass legislation against it first. So there's the Men and Boys Party in the UK. There's a party in Denmark that is working towards basically banning the circumcision of minors. And it's partially because European society doesn't circumcise. So they don't have, like 90% of the population is intact. They don't have anything, any of the cultural biases that Americans have. But there's still the sort of fear that if they do that, they're going to be accused of racism and all sorts of bad things, and basically, you know, you're persecuting my religion and all of that stuff. So I think culture has to change first. And sure, come on up.
My name is John Geiser. I'm the head of doctors opposing circumcision. My boss is right here, so I have to behave myself. Dr. George Dennison. I wanted to add that I helped write the briefs for the San Francisco case, and I want to share with you a weird irony. The groups who opposed this were mostly religious, and the San Francisco Medical Society kind of stood back and let them take the lead. But here's the irony. The judge decided that you can't regulate medical care at the local level, it has to be at the state level. But she was talking about medical care. The groups who were there opposing the initiative had no interest in medical regulation of circumcision. They were interested in keeping the practice clear of medical regulation, so they can do as they pleased, behind closed doors, with or without anesthesia, and with or without reporting botches. So now we appreciate the hurtful irony of that case was that the judge made a decision based on entirely the wrong premise for the people who were in front of her asking for a remedy.
Hold on, then. Stay up if you want.
Any other? Yeah.
So in the process of making this film, you had a perspective, you went and talked to lots of different people, and then you created the film over the course of a period of time, but we get to watch it all together, the finished product. So we feel the kinds of changes and feelings and thoughts that we have here, but how did you change over the course of making the film? And was your mind changed in any respect?
I think the biggest change that I experienced was that when I started, I thought, I'll just present people with this information and then they'll change accordingly because people are rational, and if you just give them the right information, then obviously they'll change their mind. Yeah, some of you are laughing. And of course, that is not true. But what was interesting is, you know, because I would talk to people and they'd say, oh, what do you do? And I'd say, well, I'm a filmmaker. And they'd say, oh, what are you working on? And I'd say, okay, here we go. And I would tell them, and what was interesting to me was the reactions. There was sort of this, there's some like fear around the topic, like shoulders would raise, people would sort of unconsciously guard their genitals. And I was like, what's that? And there was like a fear of even learning the information. One piece I had to take out was that Ronald Goldman, who runs the Circumcision Resource Center, occasionally gets people who write to him and they'll write to the C Resource Center, or they'll say, is this the Resource Center? Because even the word is like a little triggering to people. And so that was what I became curious about as I was working on it. It was not just, okay, there's this issue, but there's also this weird psychological thing that's going on around it, and like, what's that about? And I sort of became curious of it made me very interested in human psychology and the structure of trauma and healing, how people change their mind and are persuaded, how cognitive dissonance works, why it is that this is so difficult for people to accept. Because on the surface, it seems like if someone was to tell you, don't hold babies down and cut parts of their body off, you'd be like, yeah, that makes sense. But you know, because of the culture around it, it's very difficult change work. And so that was the piece that I sort of grew around, was understanding how people think. And I feel like the final film is not just a presentation of the information, it's also in some ways a character study, and how people respond to this, I feel like that reveals a lot about who they are.
The terrible, terrible truth of it is that we have run. We're going to do 5 more minutes. Oh, we found 5 minutes somewhere.
Does England still practice circumcision, and did you learn why it hasn't caught on in Europe or regularly done in Europe?
John, do you want to take that? I don't know what the current rate is in the UK. I know it's low, but
The UK abandoned circumcision in 1949 or 50 because the National Health Service refused to pay for it. It's as simple as that. And at that time, England was in dire straits, and every pound counted. So it was an easy shot. There was also a physician, a pediatrician, who wrote an article about what he thought was the unrevealed deaths from circumcision all over the UK. And so his article, that was Dr. Douglas, help me out. Yeah, Douglas Gardner. And those of us who follow this issue have revered Gardner for years, except for one little thing. He wrote an article which encouraged people to forcibly retract children at age 3 if they haven't been retractable yet. We now know he was wrong about that, but at least he was right about urging the NHS to defund circumcision. So it's pretty limited in the UK. It's probably in the low 10, like 5% or 6%. And some of that would be therapeutic, some of that would be dishonest, some of it would be cultural, some of it would be adult. They still have a problem with forced retractions, though, frankly. And there's a group called Norm UK that, if you are interested in the UK situation, they would be the real experts to tell you statistically exactly what's going on. I know that one scandal is the National Health Service pays for Muslim circumcisions of incoming immigrants to the UK. And of course, this is rather controversial because, in the English mind, Muslims, you're basically subsidizing something that culture-wide is not terribly approved of. So, and other people say, no, we got to accommodate them. So it's a cultural problem.
If we have one more question, once we finish here, we do have the option, because it's obviously an issue that a lot of people want to talk about. There is a lovely large room downstairs that we can kind of relocate to and continue our little chat. But obviously we need to get the others reading. One more question. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for making this film. I appreciate it. What was the most surprising thing you learned from doing this, or maybe the most challenging thing that you had to overcome through this whole process?
That's a good question. I feel like the most challenging thing was, in some way, other people's reactions. Because with other issues, even though there are huge challenges on them, people are aware of those challenges. So if I was to talk about most of the other issues that are playing even at this film festival, you'd have some reference of like, oh yeah, that is a problem. If I talk about the criminal justice system, or how we treat people in prisons, or racial issues, or climate change, or things like that, there's like some reference point. But with this, there's people who look at it like, I don't even know what that's doing on the schedule. Like, what is this here? And so people don't even realize that it is an issue. I've seen, people have signs that say, his body, his choice, and people will think it's about abortion, because they don't even realize that men have bodies and choices that they might want to make about them. That's like not even on people's radar. So I think that's the hardest thing. And then I think the other difficult challenge was, I've heard some people ask me like, oh, how are you able to, even be in the room with those people who we disagree with? And I feel like the challenging thing is that they're human and they're not the villains or monsters that people might make them out to be. There's something very normal and everyday about them, and so you don't have the option of saying, well, obviously, that was the other challenge is perhaps seeing very specifically the institutions that are still continuing this, and then realizing how much of what they do comes from the fact that they just don't know. Even Andrew Freeman, who's in the film, he's one of the authors of the most recent 2012 paper. I don't think he's even, he doesn't have any social media, he doesn't even have a Facebook. He spends most of his life between the medical place where he works and like a couple mile drive through a Jewish neighborhood. And he just doesn't even know how large this movement is, or how people feel about it, or how they're hurt by it. And so, and I think that many of the people who've been exposed to it, they have that moment of choice where they can go, okay, well, either I feel what this means and everything that comes with that, and what that might mean about me and what I've done, or I can just deny it, and then I don't have to feel that. And so that's the trickiest thing. I feel like the conflict in the film is not so much between one side and another, but people who are willing to feel and people who aren't.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, say a huge thank you to Brent for being on this.